The call came at 3:47 in the morning, and James Calloway was already awake. Not because he had been expecting it. He had been sitting in his chair by the window the way he sat most nights since Margaret passed, watching the dark outside and listening to the particular silence of a house that used to have more people in it. The baseball game had gone off hours ago. The TV showed nothing but a blue screen. He had not noticed. His phone rang once. He looked at the number, his daughter Sarah. He answered before the second ring. Her voice came through broken in a way he had never heard from her before, and he had heard her voice in every condition a father could hear his daughter's voice in: afraid, angry, grieving, exhausted, but not like this. Not this sound. This was the sound of something being torn out by the root. She said his name, she said Lily, she said gone. He was standing before she finished the sentence. He did not know he had stood up. His body had made the decision before his mind caught up with it, the way bodies did when they had been trained long enough that response preceded thought. 30 years in the Marines did that to a man, made certain things automatic. Standing when it counted was one of them. He said, "Sarah, listen to me, are you hurt?" She said no. He said, "Is anyone there with you?" She said the neighbors came. The whole colony was awake. Every parent on Harmon's Cross was awake because it was not just Lily. It was all of them. Every child between 5 and 12. 14 children. Gone from their beds between 2 and 3 in the morning without a sound, without a struggle, without leaving anything behind except the specific absence that was worse than any evidence because evidence could be processed and absence just sat there. He said, "I'm coming, don't move." He hung up. He stood in his living room for exactly 10 seconds, not frozen, processing. There was a difference, and it was important to know the difference. Frozen was what happened when fear got ahead of thought. Processing was what happened when a man with 30 years of experience took in a situation and sorted it into what he could control and what he couldn't, and what he was going to do about both. He could not bring the children back from this room. He could get to Sarah. He picked up his go-bag from the closet, the bag that had been packed and ready for 11 years since he retired, because old habits from the core died slowly if they died at all, and he picked up his keys, and he stopped at the door. He went back. He walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer and took out a photograph. Lily, 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding up a fish she had caught at the lake behind his house last summer with both hands and an expression of absolute triumph. He had taken the picture. He could still hear her laughing. He put the photograph in his chest pocket. Then he left. He drove 4 hours to Harmon's Cross in 3.5. Sarah met him at the door, and he held her for a long moment in the way fathers held daughters, when holding was the only thing available and also insufficient. He felt her shaking, and felt the specific helplessness of a man who had spent his entire adult life solving problems, encountering a problem that could not be solved by being held. He let her go. He said, "Take me to her room." Sarah led him down the hallway. The colony house was small and clean and full of the specific evidence of a child's life: drawings on the refrigerator, shoes by the door, a jacket hung crookedly on its hook. The bedroom door was open. The light was on. 2 colonial security officers stood in the hallway outside looking at him with the expression of people who had run out of things to do and knew it. He walked past them. Lily's room. Small bed. Pink blanket pushed back like she had gotten up on her own and stepped out for a moment and was about to come back. A stuffed bear on the pillow. Drawings on the wall, horses mostly. She had been going through a horse phase, and on the small desk by the window, her school tablet and 3 library books and the diary. The diary was open. He had given it to her for her birthday. Purple cover with a small brass lock that she had immediately lost the key to and had never bothered to replace, because she said she didn't have any secrets from Grandpa anyway. It was open to a page near the middle, and the handwriting was hers. large and careful the way she wrote when she was trying to do her best work, the loops slightly uneven, the letters a little too big. He read one line. "Grandpa always keeps his promises. He said he would always come for me no matter where I am. I believe him." He stood at the desk for a long moment. Then he closed the diary. He put it in his chest pocket, next to the photograph over his heart. He turned around and walked out of the room and took out his phone and made a call that went to a number that did not exist in any public directory, and that rang twice before a woman's voice answered. He said, "Nora, I need you to come yourself, not someone you trust, you." A pause. Then Director Nora Vance said, "I'm already in my car, James." She arrived 2 hours before dawn. No driver, no security detail. A plain vehicle that she had been driving herself for 19 years because the work she did not accommodate witnesses, and she had long ago stopped pretending otherwise. She came to the door, and Calloway let her in, and they stood in the kitchen while Sarah slept on the couch in the other room, finally down after exhaustion overtook everything else. Vance was 58 years old and looked it in the way that people who had done difficult things for a long time looked their age, not diminished by it, weighted by it. She had run Ghost for 14 years. She had activated it 11 times. She did not activate it lightly, and she did not come personally unless the situation required someone who understood what they were authorizing. She put a tablet on the kitchen table. She said the Varath. She said it the way you said the name of something you had been watching for a long time and were not surprised to see move. Collector species. Ancient. 300 years of operation in developing world space. They take children from pre-contact civilizations and sell them to the galactic collector market. Status symbols. The children are kept in stasis, unharmed, displayed. Calloway looked at the tablet. He did not touch it. He said, "Lily." She said, "All 14 children from Harmon's Cross are confirmed on a Varath collection vessel currently in deep transit. The ship is called the Cradle. We have its location." He said, "How long?" She said, 61 hours before they make their transfer point. After that, the children go to separate buyers and the trail goes cold permanently. He said, "Who else knows?" She said, "Nobody who matters." He said, "Good." She looked at him across the kitchen table. She had known James Calloway for 20 years, had worked with him for 8 of them, and she knew the particular quality of stillness he had right now. It was not the stillness of a man in shock. It was not the stillness of a man who was afraid. It was the stillness of a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the conversation to catch up with it. She said, "James, I need you to understand what I'm authorizing here." He said, "I understand." She said, "Ghost does not leave witnesses and does not leave records. What happens on that ship stays on that ship." He said, "I understand, Nora." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Alina Vasich will meet you at the facility. She's been tracking the Varath independently for 6 months. She has everything you need." He said, 6 months, without authorization. Vance said nobody stopped her. He nodded once. He picked up his go-bag from by the door. He said, "Tell Sarah I'll call when I have Lily." He walked out. Headlights were already in the driveway. Doc Ockefer. Raymond Ockefer, Sergeant First Class retired, who had served alongside Calloway for 8 years in 3 different theaters, and who had been Calloway's right hand in 2 situations that had never made it into any official report, and that neither of them had spoken about since. He was 49 years old and built like something that had been made out of necessity rather than design, broad and solid, with hands that were too large for most standard equipment, and had never once in 8 years of shared service let Calloway down. He was standing next to his vehicle, with one bag at his feet. Calloway looked at him. Doc said Marcus and Daniel were on Harmon's Cross, visiting their mother, my sister. Marcus and Daniel, Doc's nephews, 7 and 9 years old. Calloway had met them once at a family barbecue 4 summers ago. Daniel had asked him approximately 40 questions about the Marines in the space of 20 minutes. Marcus had sat quietly and listened to every answer with the focused attention of someone filing information away for later use. Calloway said, "Get in." Doc picked up his bag, got in. Neither of them said anything else for the first hour of the drive. They didn't need to. 8 years together had made certain conversations unnecessary. The important one had already happened. Doc was there. That was the conversation. At the 1 hour mark, Doc said, "How many?" Calloway said, 14. Doc nodded. At the 2 hour mark, Doc said, "What's the play?" Calloway said, "We go in quiet. We get the children, we come out." Doc said, "And the Vareth?" Calloway looked at the road ahead. Doc said, "Roger that." Ghost facility. An unmarked building in an industrial area that appeared on no map, and that the 12 people who knew its location referred to by a number rather than a name, because numbers were harder to accidentally speak out loud in the wrong company. Alina Vasich met them at the door. She was 31 years old and had the specific energy of someone whose brain ran faster than most environments could keep pace with. She had joined Ghost's intelligence division 4 years ago with a background in xenolinguistics and pattern analysis, and a reputation for following threads that other analysts decided weren't worth following until she proved them wrong. She had taught herself Vareth from intercepted communications 18 months ago, because she had a theory, and she needed to be able to read the evidence directly rather than through translation lag. Her office looked like the inside of a mind that refused to stop working. Every wall covered, not chaotically organized, cross-referenced, color-coded, with lines of connection running between data points in a system that made complete sense once you understood her notation. 6 months of work, ship schematics, guard rotation schedules, transfer routes, buyer networks, the location of every Vareth collection vessel currently operating in this sector, their approach vectors, their communication frequencies, their vulnerabilities. Doc stopped in the doorway. He looked at the wall. He said, "You did all this alone." She said, "Someone had to." She pulled up the main schematic. The cradle, 1,100 meters of Vareth construction, cargo configuration modified for biological transport, currently in deep transit toward the transfer point. 47 guards, Vareth military caste, children in stasis pods on Deck 7, central chamber. Single power junction in engineering, Deck 4, running the entire stasis grid. She said, "Cut the junction, and every pod opens simultaneously. Children come out of stasis disoriented but physically unharmed. Standard Vareth stasis has no lasting biological effects on humans. I confirmed this from their own medical documentation." Calloway said, "The alarms." She said, "Cutting the junction triggers every alarm on the ship simultaneously. You'd have approximately 90 seconds before 47 guards were on top of you." She reached into her desk and put a small device on the table. She had built it herself, hand-built, components sourced over 6 months in anticipation of exactly this situation. She said, "Unless you use this, it cuts the junction and simultaneously transmits a false status signal to the ship's monitoring system. The alarms think the junction is fine. You get approximately 4 minutes before the false signal degrades and the real status comes through." Doc picked it up, turned it over in his hands, put it down. Calloway looked at the schematic, 60 seconds of looking. He said, "How do we get aboard?" She said, "I created a Vareth cargo vessel identity 8 months ago. I've been maintaining it. The Cradle's docking authority will read us as a registered supply runner requesting routine dock. They run supply runners every 48 hours. We are the 48-hour supply runner." She said it simply, without pride, the way you stated a fact that you had spent 8 months making into a fact. Calloway said, "Flight time." She said, 19 hours to intercept." He said we leave in 30 minutes. Use the time. He used his time alone. 5 minutes. He sat in a chair in the corner of a room that wasn't being used, and he took out Lily's diary, and he opened it to the page. Grandpa always keeps his promises. He said he would always come for me no matter where I am. I believe him. He read it twice. He closed the diary. He put it back in his chest pocket. He sat for another minute doing nothing except being still in the way he had learned to be still before operations. The particular stillness of a man getting ready, not for the fear, but for what came after the fear, which was the work. And the work required everything you had, and you had to be all the way present to give it. He stood up. Done. 19 hours. Doc slept for 7 of them. Completely, without apparent difficulty, in the way he had always slept before operations, because Doc had made a decision long ago that anxiety was a luxury that consumed resources he needed for other things, and he simply did not permit it. Alina did not sleep. She ran system checks and updated her intelligence with 2 new data points from a Vareth communication intercept that had come in during flight, worked through contingencies, ate a sandwich without tasting it, drank coffee at a rate that Doc, when he woke up, observed was genuinely something. Calloway sat at the forward observation port and watched the stars for 3 hours, and then slept for 4, and then went back to the observation port. He watched the stars and thought about Lily at the lake last summer, holding up that fish with both hands, laughing so hard she nearly dropped it. He thought about the way she said grandpa 2 syllables with equal weight, like both parts mattered. He thought about the diary page. He thought about what he was going to do when this was over, and she was safe, and he could be a grandfather again instead of whatever he was right now. At hour 17, Alina said, "We're in approach range. Initiating supply runner broadcast." The cradle appeared on sensors at hour 18. Calloway stood at the observation port and looked at it. 1,100 meters. The numbers from the schematic had meant something. The physical object in space meant something else. Something with mass and presence, and the specific quality of something built for a purpose that made his jaw set in the way it set when he encountered things that required a response he was fully prepared to provide. Alina said docking clearance received, automated, Bay 9 starboard side. Doc checked his equipment for the last time. Calloway said comms check. 2 voices confirmed. He said we go in quiet, 4 minutes to nearest rotation. If quiet fails, we go loud and we keep moving. Primary objective is the children. Everything else is secondary. Questions. Silence. He said move. Bay 9 was dim and smelled of something that none of them had a reference for. Sweet and organic, and slightly wrong in the way that alien spaces were sometimes wrong, built by minds that processed the world through different senses and optimized for different comfort. They moved in single file, Calloway first, Doc second, Alina third. 7 minutes in, a Vareth guard came around a corner 8 feet ahead. Large, military cast, armed, doing a routine corridor check with the specific distraction of someone who expected nothing, because nothing had ever happened on this ship in 300 years of operation. He had 1 second. Calloway moved. The guard went down without a sound. Doc looked at his watch. He said rotation check in 4 minutes. Calloway said, then we move in 3. They moved. Deck 4, engineering. The power junction was exactly where Alina's schematic showed it. Access panel, Vareth construction. She had the tool, built from specs in a decommissioned Vareth maintenance manual she had found in a public commercial database, and she had the panel open in 35 seconds. The junction inside, physical relay, not purely electronic. Some things required physical redundancy even on alien ships. Alina looked at it, looked at Calloway. He said deck 7 first, we see them. They left the junction intact, and moved to Deck 7. The stasis chamber was the size of a warehouse. Rows of pods, white, sealed, the faint blue glow of operational stasis visible through the transparent panel on each one. 34 of them arranged in the center of the chamber, exactly as the intelligence said. Doc was already moving through the rows before anyone spoke, reading ID panels, moving fast, his voice low and counting under his breath. He said 34, all green. Green meant stable. Alina had confirmed it. They were okay. Calloway moved to the third row. Second pod. Lily Grace Calloway, age 8, colony of origin Harmon's Cross. He stood in front of her pod. She was asleep in the blue light, or the stasis equivalent of sleep, peaceful, untouched, small in the way that children were small, in the way that made the fact of what had been done to her hit him somewhere below the level of thought. He put his hand on the glass. 2 seconds. Then he turned to Alina. He said, cut it. She cut it herself. One clean motion, the device, the junction, no hesitation. Half a second of nothing. Then every pod in the chamber opened simultaneously. A sound like a long, slow breath released all at once, and the blue glow went out across 34 pods, and 34 children woke up. Waking from Varath stasis was disorienting. The sounds that came from the chamber, confused, frightened, the specific crying of children who did not know where they were and whose last memory was their own bed, made Doc move before anyone spoke. He was already in the middle of them when Calloway reached the chamber floor. Doc on one knee, eye level, his enormous scarred hands open and visible, nothing in them, the deliberate posture of something large making itself small. His voice was completely different from his normal voice. Lower, slower, the voice of someone who had found a register he didn't use often but had never forgotten. He said, hey, my name is Doc. I know you're scared. I know you don't know where you are. I need you to listen to me for just 1 second. The crying didn't stop, but it shifted. The specific shift of frightened children encountering something that their instincts registered as safe even before their minds did. He said, your parents sent me. Every single one of your parents. They told me to come find you and bring you home. That's what I'm doing right now. I need everyone who can hear my voice to come stand close to me. 34 children moved toward him. Not all at once. In the way of children, tentative first, then quicker, then all at once. A small girl grabbed his left hand with both of hers. A boy of maybe 7 pressed against his side. Others clustered around him until Doc was essentially invisible inside a ring of small humans who had decided, on the evidence of his voice and his posture and something that didn't have a name but was real, that this was the direction of safety. He looked up at Calloway over their heads. Calloway said, get them to the ship. Doc said, I've got them. He stood up slowly, careful not to dislodge anyone who was holding on to him, and he started moving and 34 children moved with him. A current of small people, following the large, calm man toward the corridor and the stairs and the docking port and home. Calloway and Alina turned to face the corridor. Guards were coming. They had heard the pods open. They didn't know what it meant yet, but they were coming to find out, and finding out was going to take approximately 3 seconds once they saw what they were looking at. There were 47 of them on this ship. There were 2 of Calloway and Alina. Alina covered the starboard corridor. She worked the way she worked everything with preparation. 6 months of preparation. She knew the guard positions, the response patterns, the choke points in this specific ship's layout, and she used all of it with an efficiency that was its own kind of formidable. Calloway covered the port corridor. He fought forward. That was the thing. Any tactical assessment of the situation recommended defensive positioning, holding ground, creating a perimeter. Calloway moved toward them. Every guard that appeared he moved toward, and the Varath guards encountered an enemy that advanced when the numbers demanded retreat, and the specific confusion this created cost them time, and time was what Doc needed to move 34 children to the docking port. He took hits. Vareth pulse weapons were serious, and he took 2 of them, and he kept moving because stopping was not available tonight. 4 minutes. 5. Doc's voice in his earpiece, "We're at the port. I'm counting." 6 minutes. Alina's voice, "Junction alarm is degrading. Real status coming through in 90 seconds." Calloway said, "How many guards still active?" Alina said, "Approximately 20. They're pulling back to regroup." Calloway said, "Why?" Alina said, "I think we're confusing them." Doc's voice counting, 31, 32. The reason the guards were pulling back was something Calloway had seen before, and Alina was seeing for the first time. The Vareth military caste had a specific threat response framework built from 300 years of dealing with alien species attempting to board the cradle. The framework covered every scenario that had ever actually happened. What it did not cover, what it had never needed to cover, was an enemy that advanced into superior numbers without any apparent self-preservation calculus, that absorbed serious weapons fire and kept coming, that seemed to operate on a different relationship with the concept of stopping than anything the guards' training had prepared them for. They were not retreating because they were beaten. They were retreating because they needed a moment to understand what they were dealing with. Doc's voice, 33. A pause that lasted 2 seconds and felt longer. 34. Calloway was already moving toward the port. Then High Collector Daran appeared at the end of the corridor. 400 years old. The Vareth showed age as density, not the softening of human age, but the accumulation of centuries pressing into a physical form that had become more itself over time, harder and more present. He moved through his own guards with the authority of something that had never had to assert authority because its presence was the assertion, and the guards stepped aside without being asked, and he looked down the corridor at the 2 humans who had come onto his ship. He had stopped 17 boarding attempts in 300 years of operation, every species that had ever tried. None of them had gotten this far. He looked at Calloway, bleeding from 2 pulse hits, still standing, still moving, nothing in his expression that corresponded to any category Daran had spent 4 centuries developing. Daran said in Vareth, which Alina's earpiece translated in real time, "What are you?" Calloway didn't answer. He kept walking toward Daran. Daran activated the ship's internal defense system. Every corridor sealed. 12 automated turrets came online across the main passageways, keyed to the ship's sensor network, tracking every moving target. The system had ended every threat the cradle had ever faced. It was comprehensive. It was fast. It had never been beaten. Alina fired her second device. Not the junction tool. The other one. The broad-spectrum disruptor she had spent 4 months building and 2 months testing in simulation because she had known, 6 months ago when she started following this thread alone without authorization, that there would be a moment like this moment, and she had built for it. The sound it made was barely a sound, an exhale, electronics collapsing into silence. The cradle went dark. Every system, every corridor, every light and sensor and automated turret and electronic enhancement in every guard's sensory implant. Total darkness. Not dim, absolute. The only illumination the faint chemical emergency strips along the floor that ran on a non-electronic circuit. For a human without thermal equipment, it would have been disorienting. For the Vareth military caste species that had spent centuries integrating electronic sensory enhancement into their basic perception of reality, it was blindness. Complete, immediate, total. The guard stopped. Calloway could see them on his thermal display. 30+ heat signatures going still at once, the specific stillness of beings whose primary sensory input had just been removed, and who were waiting for their systems to reboot, which they were not going to do. Daran was the largest signature in the corridor. He had not moved. Calloway walked past him. Not around him. Past him. Close enough to touch. He looked at the thermal image of the being who had taken Lily from her bed and transported her across the galaxy in a pod and thought of her as cargo. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything. He walked past Darun and down the corridor and through the docking port, and the port sealed behind him. Cade had the engines at full ready. The ship detached from the cradle while the cradle was still dark, its crew blind, its systems destroyed, its ability to pursue them at zero. The cradle drifted. Its crew was alive. Its cargo was gone. Its 300 years of uninterrupted operation were over. Calloway walked through the ship to the cargo bay. 34 children. Sitting on the floor in clusters the way children arranged themselves when they had been scared and had found safety, close together, touching. The specific social geometry of small people who needed to know other small people were there. Doc was sitting on the floor among them with his back against the wall. Several of the smallest ones were leaning against him. He had his eyes closed and his head back, and he was breathing slowly, the first slow breath Calloway had seen from him in 60 hours. He opened his eyes when Calloway came in. Calloway looked at the children. He counted. 14 from Harmon's Cross, all 14, plus the others, all 34. He found Lily in the second group. She was sitting between two older children, holding both their hands, doing the thing she did when she was trying to be brave, which was concentrating very hard on something practical, so there was no room left for being scared. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and her grandfather's habit of going quiet when the situation was serious. She looked up when he came in. She didn't run. She stood up slowly, let go of the hands she was holding, walked across the cargo bay toward him in the straight-line way that she walked, the way that had always reminded him of Margaret. He went down on one knee. She put her arms around his neck. He held her with one hand on the back of her head, her hair against his cheek, and he closed his eyes. He didn't say anything for a moment. She said into his shoulder, "I knew you'd come, Grandpa." He said, "I promised." She held on tighter. He let her. Across the cargo bay, Doc watched this with the expression of a man feeling something he had decided not to display, which meant his face was very still, and his eyes were doing something different from his face. He looked away after a moment, gave them the privacy of not being watched. Then Marcus appeared from the cluster of children and walked directly to Doc and stood in front of him and said, "Uncle Ray." Doc said, "Hey, buddy." Marcus sat down next to him and leaned against his arm and said nothing else. Doc closed his eyes again. After a while, Daniel came too, from the other side, and sat down on Doc's other side, and Doc had a child on each side of him and his eyes were closed, and the cargo bay was full of the sounds of 34 children slowly returning to themselves, the crying fading into quieter sounds, the scared settling into tired. Calloway sat on the floor with Lily in his arms and her head on his shoulder, and his back against the wall, and he stayed there for a long time. He recorded the message 2 hours out from Harmon's Cross. He did it in the ship's small communications bay, alone, the door closed, no script, just the camera and what needed to be said. He opened a broadcast channel on every Vareth frequency Alina had mapped, which was all of them, and he spoke in the same voice he had used to brief operations for 30 years. Not loud, not angry, flat and precise and absolutely final. He said, "You took our children because you believed we couldn't reach you. 300 years of operation. 300 years of taking children from worlds you considered beneath you, from species you considered too primitive to respond. You made an assessment. The assessment was wrong." He said, "We found your ship. We walked through your guards. We took our children back, all of them, every single one." He said, "We know your network, every vessel, every route, every collection point, every buyer, 300 years of records and we have all of it. He said, we are not sending a fleet. We are not filing a diplomatic complaint. We are not asking the Galactic Assembly to intervene. We are sending people like me. Quiet people. Patient people. People who will move through your network the same way we moved through your ship, without announcement, without warning, without anything you will see coming until it is already done. He said, you will not know when. You will not know where. The only thing you will know is that we came, and that what you thought was safety was never safety at all. He said, we remember our children, always. He closed the broadcast. He sat in the communications bay for a while. He thought about what it had felt like to stand in front of Lily's pod and put his hand on the glass and then turn away and do what needed to be done to get to the other side of that moment. He thought about 34 children following Doc out of a dark chamber. He thought about Lily saying, I knew you'd come. He took the diary out of his chest pocket, opened it to the page. Read it one more time. Closed it. Didn't put it back. He held it in his hands the rest of the flight. Harmon's Cross at 16:20 hours local time. The landing pad was full before they touched down. Word had traveled fast the way word always traveled fast in small colonies, where 14 families had spent 60 hours not knowing what had happened to their children. And now they knew. And the knowing had brought every person in Harmon's Cross to the landing pad, including people who had no children on the ship, but who had been awake for 60 hours anyway because that was what small colonies did. Calloway stood at the top of the ramp when it opened. He looked out at the faces below. Parents at the perimeter, held back by the specific physics of people who needed to run and were managing not to run yet. He said, bring them out. Doc stood up. He said, okay, we're going home. He said it to all 34 of them, single sentence, the same calm voice. You could feel the children orient toward it the way plants oriented toward light. Okay, we're going home. He led them down the ramp. The perimeter lasted about 4 seconds. What followed wasn't organized. It didn't need to be. Parents and children found each other through the specific gravity of people who belonged together, and the physics of it was simple and absolute, the same in any language, on any world, in any species that had ever looked for something it loved. Calloway stood at the top of the ramp and watched. A father going down on both knees in the middle of the landing pad, his daughter in his arms, his face buried in her hair. A mother and 3 children tangled together so completely, it was hard to tell where one ended and another began. Doc's sister appearing from somewhere in the crowd, stopping when she saw Marcus and Daniel, going very still for 2 full seconds, then moving. Doc watched from the bottom of the ramp. His sister reached the boys and went to her knees and pulled both of them to her and stayed there. She didn't say anything, just held them. After a moment she looked up and saw Doc standing 10 feet away and stared at him with an expression that contained approximately everything. Doc looked at her. She mouthed something, he could read it, thank you. He looked away. He was not someone who needed thanks. He was someone who needed his nephews to be standing on this landing pad. They were. That was the transaction. Lily was the last child down the ramp. She had waited. Nobody asked her to wait. She had just waited, watching the reunions below with the focused attention of someone who understood they were witnessing something that should be witnessed properly. She came down the ramp and took Calloway's hand. They walked down together. Sarah was at the bottom. She took 3 steps toward them and then stopped, the way people stopped when they had been braced for so long that arriving at the thing they had been braced for required a moment to process. She looked at Lily. She looked at Calloway. She made a sound that wasn't a word. Lily let go of Calloway's hand and went to her mother. Calloway stood back. He watched Sarah hold her daughter, and he felt the weight of 60 hours settle through him all at once, the full accumulated pressure of it finding its way out now that the holding was done. Not breaking, just releasing. the specific exhale of a man who had promised something and had kept it and was now on the other side of the keeping. He put his hand in his chest pocket. He took out the diary. He held it for a moment. Then he walked to where Sarah and Lily were standing, and he waited until Lily looked up, and he put the diary in her hands. She looked at it, she looked at him. He said, "You left it open." She said, "I know, I left it open on purpose." He said, "Why?" She said, "So you'd read it, so you'd know I believed you." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I always would have come, whether you believed it or not." She said, "I know, Grandpa, that's why I believed it." 6 weeks later, the Varath collection network began closing. Quietly, one facility at a time. No announcements, no diplomatic communications, no official statement from anyone claiming responsibility. Locations that had operated for decades simply ceased to operate, staff dispersing, equipment removed, vessels rerouted. Some closed within days of the Cradle incident. Others took longer. As if the operators were waiting to confirm that what they had heard was real, before accepting that the calculation they had built their entire operation on was no longer valid. The galactic community noticed. Nobody asked questions, because asking questions would require acknowledging what the answers pointed to. And what the answers pointed to was something that moved quietly through the dark, and that nobody wanted to confirm was moving through it in their direction. The last facility was on a trading station in the Outer Reach. It had been operating for 140 years. It closed on a Tuesday. The operator received one message before he closed it. No sender. No text. Just two things. Coordinates, his current location, precise enough to include the room he was sitting in. And a photograph. A little girl, 8 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding up a fish with both hands, an expression of complete and absolute triumph. Safe. He looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he got up and started giving the orders to shut everything down. He did it quickly, he did it completely. He never reopened.